Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vinashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadanas Trinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Kamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Yaram Yanikila Ghashanga Samshamani Shrutratritim Sangata Yaswadhya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Brajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandhini Sajiyad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Sri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Charjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will absorb ourselves in Padyavali, and in particular, discussion of Sriman Mahaprabhu's celebrated advice, Tṛṇādapi sunīcena. So in our last session discussing this verse, we began discussion of the fourth quality, specifically the quality of being far lower or humbler than a blade of grass. And we looked at some of the conventional ways that this is explained, and also at Sanatana Gosvami Pad's definition of humility or dainya in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and in particular how he differentiates dainya from nirabhimanatva, or how the absence of egotism or the absence of conceit is conceived of as being distinct from, or a quality fundamental to, but not entirely equivalent to, this quality known as dainya, or humility, and that humility is rather something more than that. Humility is a sense of disconcertion or a sense of unrest, even when one is possessed of numerous qualities or excellences and opportunities, as a result of a sense of incapacity and lowliness within oneself. And as far as why that sense of lowliness or inability persists in one's self-image, if you will, despite being endowed with various qualities and excellences, then Sanatana Pad gave reference to the idea of reflection upon the plight of samsara, or in other words, if you have an excellent seat on a sinking ship, you're not necessarily completely content with being in first class and having someone, waiting upon you. You might have, a great spot in the Titanic, but that's not necessarily going to be a cause of peace and joy once you see that the Titanic is sinking. So similarly, you might have many things within the golden prison of a privileged life in samsara, but that will still leave one with a sense of unrest or unease. So something like this, by reflecting on the condition of the jiva within samsara, there remains a sense of acute disconcertedness and a sense of lowliness and inability. So, however, Sanatana Pad mentioned there this adi, or that reflection upon the condition of samsara, is one among numerous frames of reference in the context of which this sense of disconcertion or unrest can be present in the heart and mind. So that indicates that there are also others. So that is what we'll discuss today. And what is perhaps, or I'll just say personally, is what I find particularly interesting in regard to this quality of humility and how it applies to the life of followers of Rupa Gosvami and the path of bhakti taught by him in particular. So we'll resume from where we left off last time, same file as the last reading. So I'll start from here. Regarding the intended meaning of Sri Sanatana Pad's mention of, quote, and so forth, adi, with respect to other qualities of humility, in addition to that of reflection on the dangers of samsara, Sri Sanatana Pad's mention of, quote, awareness of one's own unsuccessfulness, or of one's lack of bhakti to the lotus feet of Bhagavan, in an aforecited definition of humility given earlier in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, is worthy of consideration. So this definition of humility is found in the 5th chapter of the 2nd Kanda. But Sanatana Pad also gives great stress to the role of humility in the sadhana of a bhakta at the conclusion of the 1st canto of the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and specifically how he does so will be discussed a little bit later in this commentary, so I won't refer to that directly now. But in that place where he gives stress to the importance of humility, then there he makes this statement, that humility can arise from a sense of awareness of one's own unsuccessfulness or lack of bhakti to Bhagavan. So for those who have embraced Prem Bhakti as the Pancham Purushartha or the Parama Purushartha, have made that the aim of their life or the sole aim of their existence, then when they have yet to achieve that, even if they've achieved many other things, they feel unsuccessful, or they feel the burn of this absence, if you will. And even if they're socially recognized as being great in, social estimation of what it is to be a bhakta, even if they have followers or fame, or they have, received various accolades or whatever, if they themselves don't feel that they've actually achieved the ideal that they're supposedly representing, or that they're supposedly pursuing, or that they're perceived to have achieved, if they themselves know that they actually haven't, then they feel an acute sense of unrest, an acute sense of disconcertion, even in the midst of perhaps being well-educated, renounced, steadily engaged in many practices, etc. And to the extent that they may feel lowly and, quote, incapable, or yet to have demonstrated that they are actually capable of achieving their goal as a result of this. So, this is also a frame of reference from which this spirit arises, or how this quality of dainya comes into the heart. The forthcoming section of Padyavali, entitled There, that is Bhakta's Expressions of Humility, Tesham Dainyokti, starting from verse 59, offers ample illustrations of humility arising from these various sources of inner reflection. So be it the plight of samsara, be it a sense of unsuccessfulness in one's following of the path of bhakti, a whole section comes later here in the Padyavali, where various prayers and expressions of the heart in that spirit are made. So we're not going to quote them and discuss them in this commentary because they're in this very book a little bit later. So this is a pointer at this stage to say humility as it's been discussed thus far is amply illustrated in the verses that come. In the section in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu about the limb of bhakti known as entreating Sri Bhagavan or Vigyapti, Sri Rupa also mentions a category of entreaty known as, quote, that which is expressive of humility, dainya-bodhika, and cites the following illustration. So that whole section that comes up later in Padyavali is in the spirit of this category of prayer, this category of entreaty known as dainya-bodhika. And in the Sindhu, he quotes just this one verse to illustrate that. So we'll just discuss that one illustration, and then a little bit later on here in our discussion of Padyavali, we'll see numerous other, poems of the same genre, if you will. So he cites the following, no one is a sinner or an offender like me. I am ashamed even to atone, that is, to seek forgiveness for my misdeeds, and all the more ashamed of these misdeeds themselves. What can I say, O Purushottam? Sri Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami Pad recounts in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita that Sri Rupa Pad, accompanied by his brother Sri Sanatana Pad, personally recited this verse at the feet of Sriman Mahaprabhu during their first meeting. Sri Rupa Pad is said to have wept out of humility and held a blade of grass between his teeth as he prayed to Sriman Mahaprabhu at that time. After hearing Sri Rupa Pad's entreaty, Sriman Mahaprabhu expressed that he felt as though his heart was bursting because of Sri Rupa's humility, and then blessed Sri Rupa profusely. So this is a verse that Rupa Goswami cites as an illustration, as well as a verse that was something he himself chose to cite or to express when he himself met with Gauranga Mahaprabhu. So this verse, what does it say? To say, what can I say, is to convey that one feels to be, at a loss for words due to feeling some acute lack of ease within oneself. So this illustrates this sense of humility in the form of a sense of disconcertion, or heartache, if you will, as we'll get to in a minute. In the case of expressions such as this one cited by Sri Rupa Pad, however, it should be understood that although a bhakta speaks of oneself as lacking qualities, or having committed profuse sins and offenses, it should be understood that it is primarily the, quote, acute disconcertion, or parama vayagram, felt by the bhakta on account of reflection on the dangers of samsara, or an account of a feeling of unsuccessfulness with regard to, attainment of bhakti for Sri Bhagavan, that gives rise to a bhakta's perception of such deficiency or wrongdoing on their part. So although the bhakta is saying, I'm the biggest sinner in the world, so to speak, it may not be that they actually are, but that they feel themselves to be out of this intensity of desire or intensity of fixity upon their aim, and in the absence of achieving that aim, or in the absence of struggling through what obstacles they're encountering to reaching that aim, they acquire this sense of perception of themselves, of being greatly sinful, offensive, or what have you. Thus, such expressions are not inconsistent with the parameter given by Sri Sanatana Pad's definition of humility, that the feeling of oneself being exceptionally incapable and lowly arises even when one is endowed with all excellence. In other words, if you are actually extremely sinful and offensive, then to simply pray to the Lord, oh, I'm so sinful and offensive, doesn't give you, or that itself is not the quality that's being expressed by this verse, or that is akin to the prayer that someone like Sri Rupa Gosvami is conveying to Bhagavan by citing this verse. It's when someone is actually endowed with so many virtues, but that sense of unsuccessfulness or that sense of being in a state of plight is so acute that they nevertheless perceive themselves to be offensive or sinful or incapable or what have you. That intensity of feeling of want, if you will, is where this expression is coming. Not that it's necessarily simply a grounded reiteration of faults one has committed in the past, which is also good, or in other words, to have a clear self-perception of one's own misdeeds and to, accept them or admit them is also virtuous and also valuable, but that in and of itself doesn't constitute the standard of humility that's being defined here. Humility, as thus defined, is thus also understood to have an important interrelation with Sharanagati, that is, with taking shelter in Sri Bhagavan, as is illustrated in the following verses of Yamunacharya in his Stotra Ratna. Quote, I am neither adherent to Dharma, nor a knower of the Atma, nor endowed with bhakti to your lotus feet. Destitute and deprived of any other recourse, O refuge, I take shelter at the soles of your feet. There is no condemnable act in this world that I have not committed thousands of times. Such as I am, without any recourse now at the time of the consequences, O Mukunda, I simply cry before you. So this is a very intense expression to, fall at the feet of Bhagavan, weeping profusely, feeling utterly helpless and overwhelmed by the consequences of one's own past misdeeds, and to be devoid of adherence to the path of bhakti, adherence to the path of gyan, and adherence to the path of karma, and to thus truly be, quote, destitute or deprived of any other means, and to, in that state, seek shelter or wish to receive shelter in Bhagavan, who's described here as the refuge, or described here as he who is the ultimate shelter of the jiva. This shows how humility is integral to what is more broadly known as Sharanagati. So more on that is what we'll discuss now. Humility is described in Vaishnava Tantra Shastra to be one of the 6 limbs that constitute Sharanagati. And Sri Sanatana Pad, in his commentary in Hari Bhakti Vilas, on the verse that outlines these 6 limbs, defines humility, spoken of there by the word karpanya, as, quote, being in a state of distress or heartache, the word is artitva, in a manner such as feeling compelled to pray, O Bhagavan, please protect me, please protect me. So, in the previous discussion, or in the discussion thus far, humility has been spoken of using the word dainya. But in the verse that outlines the 6 limbs of Sharanagati, the word is not dainya, it's karpanya. So, generally speaking, the concept is the same, but the etymology obviously is different. So the word karpanya is derived from the word kripana. So the word kripana would literally convey the idea of the absence of kripa. So this has 2 different connotations, which are both found in various usages of the word in the Shastra. One of being, quote, devoid of kripa, or devoid of compassion, or devoid of grace, refers to the idea of being miserly, or being, insensitive, or devoid of showing any compassion or grace to another. So, for example, in the Gita, when Arjuna describes himself as having this karpanya dosh, then there the sense is that he perceives himself to have the fault of miserliness or being insufficiently compassionate to others. But the word karpanya and kripana can refer as not only to one who lacks compassion as far as showing it to another, but also one who has not received compassion for another. In other words, upon whom no one has showed compassion or no one has showed favor. So in that respect, it refers to someone who's pitiful or who's in a miserable or a wretched state or a humble state, a poor state of being, someone who's devoid of any fortune and or hasn't been shown any favor or fortune by anyone else. So it's in that second sense that the word is used here as a reference to a limb of Sharanagati, and thus why it's defined by Sanatana Gosvami as artitva, or a state of being in arta, or in distress. So someone that receives no favor from anyone else, in other words, who's rejected or isolated or unsupported, is thus in a state of distress. So this is how the sense comes about. So again, in the last discussion, we showed how Sanatana Gosvami is defining in his commentary humility with the word vayagram, or this disconcerted state, or this state of unrest. And now, if we look at another usage of a term for humility, or karpanya, it's defined by Sanatana Gosvami as artitva, or a state of distress or heartache. So in both cases, what's being alluded to by the word karpanya or dainya, or what we're rendering in English as humility, is not a state of, you might say, peace of mind or rest or simply groundedness, but a state of unrest, a state of being in a state of deprivation, or in a state of want and lack of what one requires or what one aspires to. So there's some important discussion of this point in the Bhakti Sandarbha. A primary illustration of such humility is found in the narration of Srimad Bhagavatam, is found in the narration in Srimad Bhagavatam of the deliverance of Gajendra, an elephant who prayed to Bhagavan in distress as a result of being attacked by a crocodile. So I'll just add here as a footnote that in the Gita, Bhagavan describes 4 persons as being worshippers of himself. Arta, arta, arti, jigyasu, gyani. Those who are knowledgeable, those who are inquisitive, those who are seeking some particular result from worshipping, and those who are arta. So arti and arta. Arti is the word, or artitva, it comes from, or being in a state of arti, or distress. An adjective describing someone in that state is arta, or distressed. So Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he refers to Gajendra as a primary example of a person who worshipped Bhagavan because of being in a state of distress. In other words, he's being attacked, he's fearing his own death, and in that state of distress, he's praying and performing a type of worship of Bhagavan. So he represents, or he's shown as an example of this state of humility, or this state of distress, or arti, with which or in which one takes shelter in Bhagavan and worships Bhagavan. So in this regard, Jiva Gosvami makes a very important point. Quote, because of the absence of the suffering of a sangsarika, being a cause thereof, the grace of Parameshvara arises, rather, only in relation to bhakti constituted of humility, such as one praying as follows, quote, he, that is Bhagavan, is my only shelter here in this world, as in the case of Gajendra and others, who prayed to Bhagavan for his shelter in this manner, and in contrast to the Denzians of Naraka and others, who may call out to Bhagavan, but not out of bhakti constituted of humility. So, what he's saying is that the grace of Bhagavan is not caused by the suffering of people in the world. Right. So, people suffer in this world, not a little, a lot. But simply their suffering doesn't evoke Bhagavan's grace upon them. Rather, if in the state of that suffering, they express bhakti, or they express bhakti specifically in the form of humility, such as this expression in a state of want, "You are my only shelter," or, quote, "He is my only shelter," then Bhagavan may, or Bhagavan shall grace that person, or show favor to that person, or offer protection to that person. But simply their suffering doesn't automatically evoke any protection or grace from Bhagavan upon them. It's when they turn to Bhagavan, when they express, as here Sanatana Gosvami is stating, "O Bhagavan, protect me," when distress is then channeled, if you will, or turned into an impetus by which one addresses Bhagavan, seeks the shelter of Bhagavan, seeks the protection of Bhagavan, and perceives or comes to recognize that Bhagavan is the only actual shelter of any living entity, then there can be grace upon that person, or then Bhagavan's attention can be captured. So this particular phrase, or this particular statement of Jiva Gosvami, that, quote, "He is my only, sa eva mama sharanam," and that to have that reflection, or have that express such conviction, is itself an act of bhakti, which is constituted of humility. And this is a point that our Guru Maharaj cites a lot, and gives stress to as being the very core of how a bhakta comes to approach Bhagavan, and the very fundamental basis of what is referred to as humility, is that perception that I'm in a state of shelterlessness, and thus of the strong conviction that Bhagavan is my only shelter. And persons who are suffering in the world, they may, gripe, or they may complain, or they may express, agony in doing so. But simply that, elsewhere Jiva Goswami, he refers to the cries of people in hell doesn't necessarily, draw the grace of Bhagavan upon them. It's when any cry or any complaint or whatever is imbued with this humility, or this sense of turning to Bhagavan as one's shelter, then that reciprocation shall be found, or then Bhagavan shall be inclined. So there's more on this as follows. It is thus to be understood that humility in this respects amounts to an experience of distress or heartache, arti, on the part of a bhakta, that inspires a bhakta to seek the grace of Sri Bhagavan, based on the understanding that Bhagavan is one's true shelter and protector. It is only distress and a sense of helplessness of this sort, which is imbued with the spirit of bhakti, that evokes Bhagavan's grace, and not simply the distress itself that a jiva undergoes in samsara, regardless of its severity. Sri Jiva explains this point further in the same section of Bhakti Sandarbha. Quote, "That," meaning Bhagavan's grace, "does not proceed independently towards the oblivious of him, even those among the oblivious who are afflicted with the difficult to bear and unending afflictions of samsara, because of the impossibility of that." This is philosophically interesting, right? He's saying it's impossible for Bhagavan's grace to come to a person who's ignorant or unaware of Bhagavan. Why? The transformation of the heart in the form of grace. It sounds a bit funny in English, but what, quote unquote, a transformation of the heart here means a sentiment, or a state of awareness. So this thing called grace, which is, a sentiment or something that arises in the heart, he's saying that only occurs when the suffering of another touches one's own heart. In other words, if we see someone in some state of being that we ourselves have experienced, then we infer that what they're feeling is the same or is akin to what we felt when we were in the same state. If we've, burned our hand in fire, and then we see someone else put their hand into fire and then express grief, then we think we're reminded of the pain that we felt when we've done that, and we infer that that person is now feeling the same or an akin type of pain to the pain that I felt. And then thus knowing that the other is undergoing pain, then sympathy, compassion, a desire to help arises in my heart. So it's because I have commiserate experience, or inferably loosely equivalent experience, that I can feel compassion for the condition of another. This is Jiva Goswami's point, that the transformation of the heart in the form of grace occurs only when the suffering of another touches one's own heart. And so by touching, it means, evokes or refers to a suffering that oneself has experienced, or, triggers a samskar, if you will, based on one's own past experiences. Now, can that happen in the case of Bhagavan? Because of the impossibility of the touch of suffering, which consists of darkness, tamas, which you could also call ignorance, upon his heart, which is just like the impossibility of a luminous object's becoming covered by darkness, on account of the establishment in the Shruti of the Jiva's distinctness from Bhagavan by virtue of his always being solely of the highest bliss in affection, that is, his being constituted of and having taste solely for the highest bliss, and his being repellent of sin. It is that is, grace's appearance in Bhagavan's heart is an impossibility. So, what he's saying is that suffering happens because of two things: ignorance and sin. Is Bhagavan ignorant? No. Is Bhagavan sinful? No. So can Bhagavan suffer? In other words, when the causes of the experience don't exist, will the effect come upon the locus where the causes are absent? No. So, if there is such a lack, if you will, in Bhagavan, that he's not ignorant and he's not sinful, is that a fault? Is that a shortcoming of his? Not at all. Rather, that's a virtue, that's a glory. There's no sin and no ignorance in him. How wonderful. And why not? Because his very nature is constituted of bliss. He is bliss, so to speak. That's what he's made of and all that he knows. So, as such, he doesn't know suffering. So that's not a shortcoming, that's a quality. And because he knows nothing but that infinite spiritual bliss, there isn't any samskar or any past experience of his for the suffering that an ignorant, sinful entity undergoes. So because there's no samskar, because there's no point of reference or point upon which inference can be made, then the experience of someone in ignorance and suffering is other to him. It's not part of something he can relate to directly because he has no experience of those things. So because he has no such experience, it doesn't touch his heart insofar as he doesn't see it and thus, infer it to be akin to something that he himself has experienced, which is of such undesirability that it thus moves one to try to remove that suffering in the other, since compassion, as we've discussed earlier, is defined as intolerance for the suffering of another. So that sense of intolerance of the other's suffering isn't evoked because one doesn't have experience of that experience such that one then feels the intolerance for it undergoing in the other. So this flies in the face, if you will, of some simplistic notions of Bhagavan or, quote, God being omniscient or, fully aware of any and all things. Here we see that there are, in this viewpoint of Jiva Goswami, some things that Bhagavan doesn't know or isn't directly cognizant of. The fact, that people, generally speaking, he has an awareness of it, but that he has the ability to directly feel it and thus have a sense of compassion that's evoked upon it. This is what Jiva Goswami is negating here. So Sri Jivapad's point here is that because Bhagavan's essential nature is that of paramount bliss, and because he is never subject to the influence of sin, he has never had and never will have any direct personal experience of the suffering felt by jivas in samsara, since that suffering is not of the nature of bliss and is a result of sin. Such suffering can thus never touch his heart and thereby lead to the evocation of his grace upon those undergoing it. For this reason, it is only a call inspired by distress or hariḥ that is imbued with the spirit of bhakti in the form of seeking Bhagavan's shelter, such that one prays, "O Bhagavan, protect me, as Sanatana Gosvami put it," or "Bhagavan alone is my only shelter in this world," as Jiva Gosvami put it. That is a cause of Bhagavan's grace upon a jiva in samsara. So it's not the suffering itself that evokes Bhagavan's compassion, but it's the prayers to him that are an expression of humility and an expression of bhakti that evoke his grace. So if someone's suffering but doesn't turn to him, doesn't come to him, doesn't seek his protection and grace, then his attention is not drawn to them. But when persons turn to him, when they call to him, when they approach him in humility with bhakti, then his compassion, his grace is evoked. This is the point. Sri Jivapad adds in this regard that bhakti becomes abundantly enkindled by connection with humility. Or in other words, people can also perform a bhakti abhas, or they can also perform worship of Bhagavan not in a state of distress, but on accident or unknowingly or belittlingly as a, cultural formality or what have you. But when bhakti is performed in this spirit of humility, with this sense of distress or with this sense of want or need or unrest, then the bhakti becomes enkindled, or it becomes, if you will, living. It becomes felt to be especially meaningful and necessary, rather than an optional activity that you might do to please others, or that you might do because it's socially required of you in some circumstances to not be perceived as contrary to the, pervading ethos of a group or a set of persons that you're, in the midst of, or what have you. So to this sense of distress or this sense of unease is valuable. It's a great impetus. It's a great catalyst, if you will, for performance of bhakti. So it has great value. So from a spiritual perspective, quote, suffering or a sense of distress that inspires one to turn towards Bhagavan is not spiritually unfortunate or spiritually inauspicious. It can be rather perceived as auspicious. So we see in cases in the Bhagavatam where bhaktas even express gratitude for the difficulties that they undergo. There's a famous statement of Kunti Devi in her prayers in the first canto, where she actually prays for a consistent, ongoing series of problems and distresses. What is it? Vipadu Santu, I forget the verse, Jagat Guru. She's saying, let these difficulties and calamities that I keep encountering, let them continue, because they keep me acutely aware and intent upon you. Whereas if I become complacent in the midst of facilities and ease and enjoyments in the world, then I become forgetful of Bhagavan and irreverent towards him. So, spiritually speaking, inconveniences, difficulties, suffering is not bad or is not inherently inauspicious, and from a particular perspective can even be perceived as a blessing, as grace, and as Bhagavan, blessing one with impetus to come towards him with more efficiency and more sense of urgency. So why? because bhakti, when it's enkindled by this distress or enkindled by this disconcertion, specifically humility, then it becomes more intense, it becomes more effective. For all these reasons, Sri Sanatana Pad, after defining humility in the definition cited above, enjoins the practice of humility for bhaktas. So, having thus explained the humility as it's defined in these two different places, now we're coming to the following statement in the Bhagavatamrita, where after Sanatana Pad defines it, he then enjoins it, or he then says, okay, this is humility, y'all should practice it. So he says, one who is wise should carefully cultivate speech, activity, and thought, by which that is humility, attains steadfastness, and should avoid contrarieties to that, meaning speech, activity, and thought, which is contrary to humility. In his commentary on this verse, Sri Sanatana Pad also states an additional reason for the importance of the cultivation of humility. Quote, because of premas being rooted in humility, humility is certainly to be carefully sustained. His point here is that humility certainly should be carefully practiced so that it is always sustained in one's thought, speech, and actions, because it is only with the support of humility that sadhana bhakti evokes the grace of Sri Bhagavan that results in the attainment of prema bhakti. So this statement, it's especially when you translate it, it's quite simple, but it's very, very important, right? Premno dainya mulakatvat. So the mula, or the root, or the base of prema is dainya. So just as without a base or a foundation or a stepping stone, you don't get or the sustained existence of something that depends upon it or rests upon it, either doesn't exist or isn't attained. Similarly, prema will not be attained or will not be sustained without dainya, or humility. So this is, a very, categorical and definitive point, that humility is integral to prema. It's the basis of prema. It's what prema sits on, or just as, from a bulb comes a flower. Without the bulb, there will be no flower. Without, first of all, dainya, there will be no prema. Without this sense of urgency, without this state of feeling of necessity and unrest, without Bhagavan, without bhakti, then bhakti that is enriched or of such intensity that it's of the nature of prem just won't happen. So because the aim of this whole path is prema bhakti, then humility, which is integral to and fundamental to that, has to be there. It has to be not only understood, but it has to be cultivated such that it becomes the bedrock, or the underlying ethos of how one conceives of self, world, life, and so forth. If indeed one, shall someday reach that state of being blessed with the self-manifestation of prem bhakti within the heart. So, Sri Sanatana Pad thus also describes, and this point is made repeatedly in the Bhagavatamrita. There's 6 or 7 places where this topic comes out. So I've just, in a compressed form, cited a few here. Sri Sanatana Pad thus also describes prem bhakti as that the root, meaning the foremost support of which is humility. And humility as that which is always favorable for, that is, supportive of the manifestation of prema bhakti, and greatly nourishing of prema bhakti, that is, a cause of prema bhakti's greatly increasing. So he says this both ways. In other words, what is humility? It's, it's that which is the most conducive thing there is to prema, the most supportive thing there is to prema. And what is prema? It's that thing which doesn't exist without humility, or that thing which is based on humility. So they're defined literally as being, coexistent, or quote, dependent, not in the, modern psychological sense, but in the ontological sense. So in this way, Sanatana Pad gives great, importance to this point. He also puts further stress on this point at the conclusion of the first canto of Brihad Bhagavatamrita, by stating that the final conclusion and course of action adopted by the sages assembled in Prayag, who had heard the entirety of Sri Narada's teaching throughout the first canto of the text, was worship of Sri Krishna in the spirit of humility. So this is the point I was referring to earlier, and this is where the other sense of humility as being based on a sense of unsuccessfulness or a sense of a lack of bhakti, where that point was made. So this comes, the end of the whole first canto, this whole teaching is given by Narad Goswami, and then the persons who heard that whole teaching, what did they take as the ultimate practical conclusion of the whole teaching? What did they then do? Quote, according to his teaching, they took recourse to pure and profound humility and worshipped the lotus feet of Sriman Madan Gopal. So what is the whole teaching? Do bhakti with dainya. Do, worship Bhagavan with humility. That, in essence, is given as the approach, the practice. So Sri Sanatana Pad comments in this regard that the sages took up this path, quote, because only by this, that is humility, does an abundance of Bhagavan's grace become manifest. So just as we discussed those points from Bhakti Sandarbha, where Jiva Goswami explains how without humility, Bhagavan's grace will not come down upon a jiva, then just like that, here Sanatana Goswami is saying that it's only from humility that an abundance of Bhagavan's grace comes upon a bhakta or an aspirant. So in this way, we see, the crucial ontological sense as well as the practical sense and the psychological unfolding of how humility, comes into the heart and mind and how it's so instrumental in the attainment of bhakti and the reception of Bhagavan's grace. Regarding the aforementioned instruction given in Brihad Bhagavatamrita 2.5.2023 to carefully cultivate speech, activity, and thought by which humility attains steadfastness, it should be understood that the principal application of this instruction is to foster an attitude of humility within the mind. So now, in other words, let's talk practically. Sanatana Goswami says, with your speech, your thoughts, your actions, you should act in such a way that is always conducive to or supportive to humility. So how do you do that? And that's what I'm adding here. Or in other words, how to apply this instruction. So foster an attitude of humility within the mind by exercising one's faculty of discernment, or vivek, regarding the thoughts and emotion one experiences. So first of all, how it is cultivated in the mind will be fundamental to speech or actions that one performs. So the most important thing to understand is how to cultivate it in the mind, how to recognize what are thoughts and emotions that are supportive of humility and what are contrary to humility, and how to deal with them. So, a lot of further things could be said on this in a practical level. I'm not going into full practical analysis or case-by-case studies, but just as a general rule of thumb, with one's vivek, or the application of the buddhi, one has one's self-awareness of one's own thoughts and emotions. So what do? Such that one nourishes samskaras conducive to humility with attention and absorption of the mind, and refrains from nourishing those contrary to humility through patient, detached observation of the thoughts and emotions they inspire. So we encounter so many thoughts, so many emotions throughout, our daily lives. So those that are conducive to this sense of Bhagavan's being my only shelter, of sustaining awareness and aspiration for Bhagavan and shelteredness in Bhagavan, thoughts, attitudes, emotions that are related to that, when those come, those can be sought and cultivated and focused on. And when things are contrary to that, when things are other than that, then they may come due to our, the present state of our mind. Many other, things will arise, but with a detached but patient, observation of them, we'll endure that or note that without seeking to excessively exacerbate those unfavorable samskaras, but rather, the analogy is sometimes given that the mind is like a dog. If you feed it what you feed it, it keeps coming back. So the samskaras that you nourish with attention and action related to them, and intensification of the emotions related to them. Something makes you angry, you get angry, you put on angry music, and you get yourself up into a stew. This then deepens your anger samskar. This is not the way you want to go with things, but rather to, if when anger or unfavorable things like that arise, observe that, be willing to recognize that, accept that, tolerate that, but don't take action or don't foster thoughts that deepen the tendency for anger, but just patiently, with some non-attachment, recognize it, accept it, undergo it, but act and think in such a way that the samskara for the virtues of humility, tolerance, respect, and so forth are nourished, rather than the tendency to be arrogant, cruel, and whatever in the other outcomes of anger. So, like this, I'm, just in a very simple sense, this would be how to apply Sanatana Goswami's instruction to cultivate humility within the mind. Accordingly, speech and actions that strengthen samskaras conducive to humility are to be fostered, and speech and actions contrary to that are to be avoided. For example, actions such as offering obeisances to Vaishnavas and rendering practical services to them are fit to be practiced, and actions such as causing disrespect to Vaishnavas and taking service from them are to be avoided. Similarly, speech that conveys respect and appreciation for the qualities of Vaishnavas is to be fostered, and speech that contains self-praise and defamation of others is to be avoided. An example of application in thought, word, and deed of this instruction to bring about steadfastness of humility within the heart can be vividly perceived in the conduct of Sri Rupa and Sri Sanatana, when a renowned traveling scholar came to Vrindavan and wished to debate them so that he could bolster his reputation by proving that he was more erudite than them. Sri Rupa and Sri Sanatana neither felt any inclination to prove themselves more erudite than the scholar, nor considered that demonstrating themselves to be more erudite than him to society would be favorable either to their absorption in Bhagavad Bhakti or to their representation of it to society. They thus declined to engage in debate with the scholar, although they were well capable of outdoing him, and simply signed the list of those that had accepted defeat before him. And as a footnote, when I was writing this commentary, I was discussing some of the points that I'm including in it with our Guru Maharaj, and he himself gave this example on this topic. So I, give recognition to this illustration from his suggestion. Regarding the primacy of cultivation of humility within the mind, it should also be understood that speech and action that is culturally understood to be expressive of humility can become a form of deceitfulness, or kapatya, if it is employed as a mere means to impress or secure the favor of others, and is not cultivated as a practice secondarily supportive of a primary practice of bringing about the steadfastness of humility within the mind. In other words, if someone, gives, very sort of elaborate forms of obeisances or a lot of foot touching and dust rubbing and, a lot of the cultural gestures that are shown to respected sadhus or to Vaishnavas, and makes, some kind of grand or, drummed up version of this or a, intense version of this, but then practically speaking isn't actually cultivating these virtues throughout the whole of this life. It's just a social performance that they're aware of, or just a means of, acting cute or acting in a way that might, secure them, some reciprocal respect back for themselves. If merely these things are going on and there isn't actually a real attempt to live in the spirit of humility in one's life and have an actual attitude of humility. In other words, sharanagati, a state of feeling utter unrest in one's existential condition. If those things aren't there, after you go to some function, you do a big, dandavat, foot touch, head rub, dust thing, and then you just go back and, you don't study anything, you don't practice anything seriously, you don't actually take the whole path of bhakti seriously. This doesn't shine. This doesn't really impress anyone. It's not really that valuable. And if it's done, moreover, as a means of, socially networking and getting mutual respect among the Vaishnava society, then this is actually just using symbols and using behaviors that are part of Vaishnava culture as the pursuit of pratishta, as means to get, the various worldly things that one wants, like social support and, celebrations and excitement and all this. So it ultimately, erodes the culture, or erodes, the meaning and the dignity of gestures that do carry specific meaning within Vaishnava culture. So if one wants to do physical or verbal expressions of humility, good, but let it be on the basis of actual knowledge and understanding of what humility is, and knowledge of the path of bhakti, and actual cultivation of it within one's heart and mind. Otherwise, it's cheap and, can turn into something that actually is unfavorable. So thus, how one goes about cultivating humility through one's speech and physical actions should be done sincerely and commensurately with the depth of one's cultivation and realization of humility within the mind. Making exaggerated verbal or physical gestures that are culturally recognized as expressive of humility, when they are not actually proximately reflective of one's state of mind and behavior in general, can result in hypocrisy and the erosion of Vaishnava culture, rather than truly convey respect for those to whom they are expressed and effectively nourish the samskaras of a sadhaka that are conducive to genuine humility. In other words, 1,000 times we see people, especially in India, who know how to physically act out a meeting and respectful greeting of an honorable person. But they have no, I'm saying not everyone, but there are so many cases in which people don't have any depth of knowledge of what those gestures are actually meant to express, and what is, the humility, the bhakti defined in these texts. And so they just act it out the way someone else has shown them how to physically act it out, but it doesn't actually help them develop the samskaras for bhakti, or it doesn't actually nourish the bhakti vasana. It's just a bunch of social conformity and social performance. So in every case, it's always on the basis of education that physical application will be instrumental in the actual purification and enrichment of the state of the psyche. So this is where, it's, in one sense you might say no harm, it's nice that they act respectfully. True, but, if it remains merely that, it's still sadly quite far from what anything is meant to be. Oh, sorry, this line just dropped. Let me reopen this. Okay, so I think I'll stop here for today. That's about our time limit. Sorry, let me just open this thing here. All right, so I'm concluding here. If anyone has comments, questions, or anything related to what we discussed today, please feel free to share. Yes, I see a couple hands. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm not sure. It's just a couple of hands. I'm not sure who is first.
You're talking, you're first.
Okay, so I have many questions, but I don't want to take over in part. First of all, you mentioned that sin is caused by, that suffering caused by sin and ignorance. And of course, we know that Vaishnavas also suffered. Queen Kunti is one of the first examples that comes to mind. Is it different type of suffering, or it's just suffering caused by the existence in this material world that you cannot avoid do sin and wrongdoing? Gita says that every action has a fault in it, just like a fire has a smoke. So my question is, what do I constitute sin? And is every sin or action? I'm sorry, not sin, suffering. What constitutes suffering? What actually is this? What causes the suffering? Because we know different cases of devotees also suffer.
Right. Well, I mean, we talked about this pretty amount of detail when we discussed tolerance like a tree. We discussed 3 features or 3 angles of vision by which this can be perceived. It can be perceived as prarabdha karma. It can be perceived as the grace of Bhagavan, and it can be perceived as acts of nurturing for bhaktas. So in the case of bhaktas, quote-unquote, suffering, they may take it that this is the prarabdha karma, this is the outcome of their past actions, and specifically, you could say, quote, sinful actions, or here by sin, we mean what is technically called pop, and pop simply means to cause, inconvenience or cause discomfort to another. So the world exists by eating and living upon other living entities. So you can't live in the world without causing discomfort or harm to other living entities. It's impossible. So as long as you're in the world, you're going to encounter the consequences of doing that, or you're going to encounter instability or inconvenience in your embodiment because your embodiment is based on creating instability and inconvenience in the embodiment of another. That's how the whole thing works. So you're going to, as long as you're participating in this cycle of action and reaction, you're going to undergo it. So you can simply perceive the outcomes of that as prarabdha karma. Or, as we discussed, based on the Tattvanukampam verse, commentaries of Jiva Gosvami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, this can also be perceived rather as Bhagavan's grace, because it can lead to, in the case of a bhakta, this enkindling of humility, which we discussed today. Or it can just simply be perceived as not karma, or even, a grace coming in the form of karma, but rather like the guardianship of a father for his son, like the slap that he might give him as an act of discipline. In other words, it's all conducive to and supportive of one's remaining sheltered in and engaged in bhakti to Bhagavan. So this is all points that we discussed earlier on. So suffering in essence, according to Nyaya Shastra, is simply an unfavorable feeling or a state of discomfort or a state of dis-ease. And that in and of itself is not antithetical to bhakti. It's simply, just one of many sensations that are perceived by the psyche. So people can put a negative narrative around that by saying, I want sukham or anukul vedaniyam, as it's defined in the Nyaya Shastra, as simply favorable feeling or pleasant feeling. But, the premise of the entirety of the Upanishads and Vedanta and ultimately the culture of bhakti is based on the distinction between shreyas and preyas, or, that simply, favorable feeling is also known as preyas or pleasure. And this is defined in contrast to shreyas or well-being. So depth of experience, depth of meaning never comes about simply from a flat state of ongoing pleasure, right? Even, if we look at, taste, many of the spices that create the most palatable tastes contain bitterness in them, they contain astringency in them, they contain pungency or sourness, and that it's a blend of these elements that makes something the most tasteful. It's not just a bunch of sugar and nothing but sugar, right? But it's, mixtures of sourness and pungency, or, chocolate is bitter. It's chocolate plus sugar that tastes good, So similarly in the bhakti world, it's not that all these leelas are just a bunch of, pleasures. They're also filled with stresses and, tensions and all kinds of, quote, unfavorable feeling, or, what is literally defined as suffering. So this is a whole thing that Rupa Goswami develops in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, how even, quote unquote, dukkha, or this unfavorable or unpleasant feeling, is actually ontologically also a form of paramananda, or also a form of the bliss of bhakti, in the case of Bhagavan's Parshadas who are relishing bhakti rasa, and that it's comparable to, the analogy is given where if you make a tree shape out of sugar candy, it's the shape of it is a tree, but it's just sugar, it's just sweetness. So similarly, it's actually bliss, or it's actually a state of divine, wonderful experience, but the form that it's in is in the form of a, quote, unfavorable feeling, or a state of suffering. So although it seems like a contradiction that bliss and suffering could be, you would think it's like a black and white distinction, in the case of bhaktas and in the case of those who participate in Leela, there isn't any black and white distinction between them. Rather, the famous statement in the Charitamrita is there, Bhaje Visha Jalahoy Bitare Anandamoy Krishna Premarat Bhuta Charit, that the astonishing nature of Krishna Prem is that externally it appears like someone is suffering from acute pain, like they've been bitten by a venomous snake, but internally there's a bliss within that. There's a joy within that, and that's not even exclusive of worldly experience. If you think about, sports, if there's some championship match and all the players are struggling and sweating and perspiring and getting injured and, going to the ultimate max that their bodies can tolerate, and then finally in the last second of the game they persevere and win, that becomes a source of joy and pleasure that's vastly greater than just sitting in a state of ease and contentment, or even winning by, a huge margin, but being challenged to the very extreme of one's capability and just exceeding the necessary mark and undergoing like the maximum amount of integrated suffering into the pleasure is actually produces the greatest chamatkar, the greatest thrill and, excitement that can happen. And, rasashar chamatkar, the essence of rasa, the pervading element of all rasas is adbhutatva, or this sense of astonishment or wonder. So wonder never happens without a contrast, without a tension, without the scope for or a certain degree of unfavorable feeling or bitterness in the sweet, if you will. So from, this perspective, be it in a worldly sense or in a spiritual sense, there's, you could say, the dichotomy of pleasure and pain. There's like a meta level beyond that, which is what you might call like an ultimate state of fulfillment or like endearing experience. And in the case of bhaktas, that's very much relished. If, Bhagavan just sat down on a seat and said, okay, go for it. You can just worship me and I'll give you like a giant mansion with like unlimited materials of every type. And you can just cook and offer and burn up and do all the incense and cooking and everything you like. And I'll just sit here and smile the whole time. That would never happen, there would be no Leela, but it's only the encountering of the obstacles and the, perseverance through the challenges and the expressions of arts in the midst of, certain, unexpected circumstances. It's only all of that brings out the rasa. It's, Krishna didn't just show up on the bank of the Yamuna and say, okay, let's dance. right? First he jokes, he sends them home, then he leaves, then he makes them cry, then he comes back. There's all these elements that, contain within it what you might call acute suffering. I mean, the gopis were moved to the point of abjectly weeping in a state of emotional agony, and yet they cherish the Rasa Leela as the ultimate, peak of their experience with Krishna in Vrindavan, and they suffer acutely in the absence of that Rasa Leela when he's away from, Vrindavan. So it's when there's that, highly nuanced, exceptional blending of suffering with pleasure into this integrated entity called Leela, or into this, unfoldment of exchange, that things become ultimately so satisfying, and there's such a deep samskar created, and such a wonderful state of adbhutatva, or this astonishment. So anyway, I'm elaborating perhaps excessively on what you brought up, but just to get back to what you originally said, suffering is, an unpleasant or an unfavorable feeling in an abstract sense, and then whether that is truly negative or truly undesirable or not depends on, the level of awareness of the person and the type of ideal that they pursue. And in the case of bhaktas, it can be said that there is no suffering insofar as they perceive and accept that suffering as a valuable remedial measure, as an expression of Bhagavan's own grace and guardianship of themselves, and so on. So did I touch all the points that you brought up or not?
Yes, definitely, as you brought up. And I'm still thinking of the cause of suffering. I understand the suffering can, I think you spoke more of the nature of the suffering in different circumstances for Nitya Siddhas and for Vaishnava in general. So basically, suffering taken out of context it's a suffering, but in the context of Leela, in the context of spiritual sadhana or spiritual awareness, it's not. It's actually part of the great scope of journey. Or even Leela, in our conditional state, could be taken as a helpful aid to surrender, to Sharanagati. It's a part of Sharanagati. Suffering is fine. But I'm more pondering over a cause of suffering. What would cause Bhakta to suffer? Why would Krishna make them suffer? And if he's not, as you said, he's not aware of suffering at all, he has no concept of anything like that, why would Pandavas be put in difficult circumstances? Why? I understand. My understanding is that suffering is, in this material world, is caused by interaction within this material world. It's just karmic reaction, nothing else. But is there anything else? Bhaktas.
Well, in the case of bhaktas, we can say the impetus is Leela. So, karma, Leela, we can define these as opposites, if you will. That, what is that verse? Shrishtyadikam naiva harir. How does it go? Naiva prayojanam. Kurute kevalanandad yatha martasya nartanam. I'm not forgetting the whole verse, but where it says Bhagavan has no necessity of emanating, sustaining, and dissolving the universe. Rather, he does all of this out of bliss. The only motivation or the only driver for him is to express Ananda. And he's like a drunk dancing. This is what the verse says. He's just blissful, and his movement, his action is an outcome of that bliss. So, Leela is such. Leela is action that is an outcome of bliss. Karma, you could say, is the action of someone devoid of bliss trying to get bliss. So, when you lack it and you pursue it, and whatever you do also reduces it in another, then your acquisition of it is always limited and ultimately is then taken back from you. And this is the zero-sum game called samsara, or called the exchange of karma. But in the case of lila, there is also activity, and there may also be all what appear to be the same things. There's hunger. Hunger is a terrible suffering. I mean, for people who are starving, it's an acute misery. But at the same time, if Bhagavan never got hungry, how would you feed him? How would there be the joy and the bliss of eating and giving and all the love that can be expressed through the exchange of feeding one another and cooking and all the efforts made to acquire the ingredients and all of these things? So there needs to be these certain absences or these certain quote-unquote scope for discomforts in order for Leela to even exist. So we can say that is manifested by Bhagavan out of his bliss or for the sake of his bliss, and therefore is an apparent suffering or an apparent state of want, which actually is a means of facilitating an ever fresh, ever increasing state of fulfillment. Mm-hmm. So, why would a bhakta undergo that? Why wouldn't they? In other words, it's great. It's self-evidently relishable.
Right. Yeah, there's a point of understanding that everything is Bhagavan's Leela. It's really important. Everything is expression of his Ananda, and he's so distant to things that happen in the material world, but it just happened. And remotely or directly, somehow we are affected by whatever is happening. And to understand that actually everything is happening because of his will, directly or indirectly, it brings the sense of this happiness or settlement, even in most unsettling situations. Thank you. Oh, you know what? What comes to mind also, the Kaviraj Goswami praying that he is the lowest of all. It's just the warminess to, and it just, that's maybe touches on a different topic, but it also brings that sense of, yes, loneliness, a lawlessness, and suffering. But despite of that, someone feels, yes, it's perfect. And if I may, also as because when you are talking about these customs of offering Vaishnava's honor and being, a show of humility and respect, and that can be external. I was wondering, because I heard that Raghunatha Goswami paid 200,000, 2 lakhs of dandavats to Vaishnavas in Vrindavan and Radha Kund. And I was wondering, is it metaphorical, or actually if he was doing that, was it, how did he do that?
I haven't heard any detailed account of exactly how he went about that, but as I generally understand it, and as you sometimes see sadhus doing, they may stand in one place and simply, stand like a little bit the way, people do sun salutations or Surya Namaskar, like stand, bow all the way down, stand back up, like as a, ongoing like regimen of repeated exercises, or a little bit the way people move the rock and do the Dandavat Parikrama around Govardhan.
Yes.
It may be that he, stood in one place and then in his mind thought of a Vaishnava, gave a pranam, stood back up, thought of a Vaishnava, gave pranam, something like this. And also, I'm sure, the people that he met throughout the day that he would see, he would give pranam to them, that may also be integrated in that. So I haven't heard any account or seen any literature that gives specific detail about that. So that's all I can say.
Well, that's just quite a big number.
Pranam, Baba.
Pranam.
When you mentioned that Bhagwan has no experience of suffering, at what exact point in the psyche of Gajendra that he responds to in his plea to Bhagwan for help? At what exact change in the psyche did Bhagwan then now respond?
Saeva mama sharanam, just as it's said there in the statement, Jiva Goswami says, when Gajendra said, he alone is my only shelter, when that thought is in Gajendra's mind, when he's turning to Bhagavan, or he's holding that sense of, he is my shelter, then that is what, triggers, or that is what draws Bhagavan's attention. As we heard earlier in the chapter, Sakrideva prapanayas tavasmite chayachate, where Bhagavan Ram vows, if someone even once surrenders to me and says, I am yours, in other words, that one act of saying, I am yours, or he is my shelter, then that evokes the attention of Bhagavan.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, perhaps we can just add also that there's also varying degrees of depth to that. In other words, someone may say that, and that may indeed evoke Bhagavan's grace, but with time, or with gradual purification, the intensity or the clarity or the substance with which that cognition happens will also proportionately intensify. And similarly, the degree of Bhagavan's reciprocation will also be more commiserate. So Sanatana Gosvami, he concludes the Prakaran on Sharanagati and Hari Bhakti Vilas by saying that Sharanagati is, of different degrees of intensity, and the degree of grace, the degree of result that comes from it is also commensurate with its relative depth. So we can add that as well. And then also Sharanagati from a broader perspective is also generic and can be enriched with a particular bhav, a particular spirit, and that can evoke further specific response from Bhagavan, just as the prayer of Gajendra and his sense of you are my only shelter, that doesn't evoke the same grace and response that the gopis' call and prayer to Krishna for his shelter does, right? According to the bhav, the richness of what is expressed, there's also further commensurate reciprocation.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Yeah, because my next question was going to be if you could explain the difference between humility one practices to avoid aparad versus the humility that arises from bhakti, which manifests in the heart. So I guess it's the degree of, I would assume that humility that arises from bhakti manifesting in the heart, that would be of a more, of a genuine humility. Am I right?
Sure, but I don't know if there's a black and white distinction between the two. If we think about this from a broader strategic perspective, suppose if you're raising your son, or you're trying to look after someone, then you have to guide them, you have to protect them from dangers in their life. And part of that may be, like a little kid, you hold the kid's hand when you walk across the street, otherwise they might trip or they might run off into traffic. There's a stage where the duty of the guardian is to literally protect the child. And then there's a further stage where the protection is mainly done by disseminating knowledge and teaching a certain sense of awareness, whereby the kid eventually learns how to look both ways and then cross the street by themselves. It's not that the parent for their entirety of the kid's life is there to hold them by the hand every time they cross the street. There's a stage for that, and then there's a stage for teaching the person how to cross the street themselves and to understand what are oncoming cars, to have a fear or an awareness of the danger of an oncoming car, whereby the person acquires alertness of their own accord. And once the person is capable of being alert to dangers to themselves, they no longer need to be physically held and protected from those dangers. That alertness that was enkindled in their mind now itself automatically protects them. So similarly, what's the point of this whole advice of Mahaprabhu? If from a practical point, the purpose is to protect people from committing offense, then what is this humility? It's ultimately that alertness to one's existential condition, whereby one will not engage in that activity of one's own accord. In other words, when one knows that an oncoming car or a fire is danger to oneself, nobody runs into traffic and nobody puts their hands into burning fire. You don't need to tell them that anymore. They automatically do that. They automatically themselves are afraid of those things because of the alertness and the awareness of the consequences that they now have. Similarly, if one has, what we're talking about today, this reflection upon the plight of samsara, or this acute sense of lack in one's attainment of bhakti or the successfulness of one's birth, if that alertness is actually there, then there's an impetus within oneself automatically to not do the things that are deprecating of that or directly contrary to that. So to quote-unquote instruct or teach people humility, or to, as Sanatana Gosvami is saying, to take up thought, speech, and action which is conducive to its steadfastness within the mind, as it's comes out in literal translation, would be to study or to learn and contemplate, reflect, pray, etc., such that that alertness or that sensitivity to how certain actions are contrary to the pacification of that sense of unrest, or in other words, to the attainment of the goal, the absence of which is causing the state of unfulfillment within oneself, then there will be an automatic drive within oneself to do that. In other words, when one knows the consequences of committing aparadh, and one is, acutely in a state of awareness of the need to be free from it, then there's the caution or the self-awareness within oneself, such that that will auto-regulate one's behavior, such that one won't do those activities. So ultimately, the purpose of the instruction is to bring about that state of caution or that state of alertness within the sadhaka, such that they proceed on the path properly, or proceed on the path in a way that they don't run off the side of the road and create obstacles for their own attainment. So when we understand humility as it's defined in this sense of this state of disconcertion or this state of distress, if one acts and cultivates that within oneself, then that itself will bring about a sustained sense of alertness, whereby one will refrain from activity that will only increase one's, or only be detrimental to the problem one's already saddled with. In other words, it will lead to people becoming cautious about and consciously aware of avoiding aparadh, which is, on a practical sense, what the verse is trying to teach.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Sure. All right, so let's stop here for today. And we've got more on this topic, and where this notion of humility, a further, or sorry, let me just go a step back. We started this class with explanation of the word adi, or the quote, and so forth, that Sanatana Gosvami spoke of. Then we supplied one filler to that blank, if you will, from an earlier passage in the text about a state of unsuccessfulness or a state of lack in one's attainment. So in the coming classes, we'll look at sub-drivers of that state, as well as other things that could fill in that blank, as far as what it is that gives rise to that state of disconcertion or distress that's called humility. And this will ultimately take us to discussion of the separation felt by Bhagavan's bhaktas for him, and ultimately expressions of the gopis in particular, and how this statement or this metaphor of being humbler than a blade of grass alludes to well-known prayers in the Bhagavatam for existence in Braja, and ultimately prayers that highly exalt the position of the Braja gopis. So that's a roadmap for where we're on our way. So I conclude here for today, and if we're so blessed, we'll continue again on Monday. Jai Shri Radhe. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai, Radhe Shyam. Vaishnavibhyo Namo Namah.